I go back to the days when there were urban planners in this building who hated the architects because they regarded the profession of architecture as one which depended upon the people in banks and in real estate development officers whom they detested for political reasons. And the planners were taken from us. They were a very distinguished group of people, even though they didn't like us. They were still distinguished. And they were used to create the School of Public Policy across the street. I'm just going to do this. Okay. The way cities look reflects the values of the establishment who builds them, and their power operates through institutional arrangements that are sanctioned by society. When these arrangements become intolerable, they are sometimes altered by armed revolution, sometimes by technological change, like the industrial or more recently the information revolution. But still, the values which define a culture have unusual staying power and often remain encoded in our decisions of how to live together, in our pattern of relatedness, though what we build may appear to scramble the code. The autocratic regimes which made the old European places we love to visit enforced a politics of privilege, patriarchy, prejudice, and often terror. The coherent residential fabric of an Italian hill town represented the submission of the people and concealed the squalor of private life, offset by the piazza provided by the Duke. Yet we rarely contain the pleasure of being in such places because they once embodied the set of values we have come to reject. The reverse of this double standard is to complain of our own built environment as irrational, ugly, sprawling, cynical, and a dangerous mess. And yet underneath, it may actually, as Rainer Banham suggests, cradle and embody the most potent current version of the great bourgeoisie vision of the good life in a tamed countryside. Our Constitution set out to define a set of institutions which would allow the greatest number of citizens to live the life they chose in the pursuit of happiness, to define a system, therefore, that minimized constraints on the individual's free choice, while promoting different opinions on what this might mean. The urban consequences of these aspirations are all around us. We just haven't learned to like them. At least this was the case until the green god spoke from the burning oil that there are to be environmental commandments limiting freedom of choice and upsetting markets. Together with the 99% of us already disadvantaged by these same markets, our troubles amplified by dangerous population growth in the wrong places like Africa and Mexico, we are entering a period of accelerating instability which will degrade cities and alienate architecture still further from urban design. The unfettered free market has met its match in recalcitrant natural systems, and limits to growth do raise questions about an economy based on consumption. These limits, at the same time, may engender a new consensus of feeling, an agreement on what matters, which in the past has been the precondition for fully embracing architecture rather than just kissing it. To paraphrase Siegfried Gideon, an apologist for the old modern, because the computer has made it possible to imagine non-Euclidean form, it is necessary to build it. One can imagine a continuously curved paperweight, a chair, even a house, museum, or office tower, but not part of a city. A change in scale, after all, remains a change in form. Because the urban condition is so intractable, architects can enjoy a design strategy without regard for its application to urban design. No wonder, with very few exceptions like Koolhaus in Maine, the urban scale, once a preoccupation of our most gifted architects, has been abandoned to economic forces of daunting complexity and power. Into this world of complexities, compromises, and political crosswinds, few in the academy wish to trespass and lose the comfort of a civilized remove, especially as events seem to presage a degraded future of loss in which humanist values are increasingly at risk while the arts evaporate. Nevertheless, our speaker tonight has still been willing to engage the big actual, and few places are as actual as his Houston, sporting its stupendous, gigantic carbon boots. Despite anything goes Houston, Albert Pope actually thinks and writes with thoughtful penetration and often with definitive insight about the meaning and design of urban places. Albert?
That was a wonderful introduction. The loss, the disconnection between architecture and urbanism is something that has driven what I do for a very long time. Since I've actually been thinking and working, actually since I've been a student, was a student here. The alienation of architecture from urban design, which Richard just spoke about, to me is a loss, a dramatic loss for architecture, in so much as it tends to limit. Is it still working? Good. In so much as it tends to limit the significance of buildings, which I'm ultimately obsessed with, at the property line, and to take seriously how it is we break the boundaries of the property line. One of the things I've focused on recently, and I'll talk about tonight, is the relationship between architecture and urbanism, in so much as it affects scale. Richard just mentioned it, that changes from architectural design to urban design are not just changes in scale, they're changes in kind. Oftentimes, I think perhaps the polemic of SML-XL, that somehow XL makes it all the way to urbanism, has led us to believe that very, very large architecture, superblocks, even something that could start to qualify as a megastructure, is urbanism. But I've always felt that it's not gone far enough, that somehow a superblock that may cover 10, 15 blocks is not the kind of design approach that would also work for 1,000 or 10,000 blocks, to use an outdated term. So what I would like to do is to present two projects tonight. The first one is going to go from architecture towards urbanism. Then I'm going to do a brief interlude about what might constitute urbanism, the urbanism that we attach ourselves, our architecture to today. And then the second one is going to come from the other side. It's an incomplete project that tries to move from architecture, from urbanism down to the scale of architecture. Beneath all of this is one very simple concern, and that is, if I can say it without sounding glib, the relationship between the formal and the social. What is the relationship is there a relationship between the formal and the social? That question could be rephrased a little bit by saying, who exactly are we designing for? Who are our discourses ultimately targeting? And what constituencies do our forms and spaces call into existence? Because I believe they do. Right? You may object with that to that right off the bat, but if you give me a moment to make the case, I think it's probably the strongest way that architecture is employed in the way that what we do, our forms and spaces, actually bring constituencies into existence, and who are those constituencies is the question that I'm going to try to get to run through this presentation. Starting from architecture and moving towards urbanism, we found this competition summer before last in Taiwan, for Kaohsiung, which is the second largest city in Taipei, to do a pop music center. It's a fairly large program that is essentially the site ringing an artificial harbor, which you can see in the image that's in front of you right now. It, for us, was a pretty interesting starting point. You can see it's an estuary that's been cleared out, and an artificial frame has been put around the edge. The plaza, the urban plaza, is a void. This is about 350 meters square. It's somewhere between the size of the Zocalo in Mexico City. If you've seen it, that's already a huge size, but quite a bit smaller than Tiananmen Square. Somehow we immediately started to think about the public square or an urban plaza, and of occupying that square, occupying it from the edge, but in a way that acknowledged that ultimately the center of the square would be void. In some ways, it seemed to us right off the bat, almost without even thinking about it, that the large square, perhaps the public that it would call into existence, is somewhat in question. The void being a kind of placeholder, the fact that the square is wet and unoccupiable, allowing us to occupy the fringe, seemed like an interesting problem. We took the competition on that basis. This competition was done with two colleagues, Troy Sham and Rosalind Shea, who had an enormous amount to do with it, and I need to credit them right off the bat. Obviously, the first question that might come to mind is, if we are thinking of this big square that is the largest open space right adjacent to the center of Kaohsiung, as a public space, what kind of public does it bring into existence? Maybe another question to add, another way to ask that same question is pop music the occasion for a public gesture? Which I think is actually a pretty interesting question. We might wish for something that is more stable than pop music, than a commercial phenomenon, something that's formulaic, but also something that is huge. This is it's called Mandarin pop, larger than pop music is in the West by a good degree, and a lot of the stars, rising stars, are Taiwanese for some particular reason, leading to it to be a point of pride. It seemed that somehow if we couldn't leverage a full-scale social space, public space, on the back of pop music, perhaps the instability or the frivolity of pop music. Maybe we could do it if it were qualified by the fact that the space is actually a void, that the space in fact is unstable as the occasion that brings it into existence. And we could work with that. We could go forward with that. This was our first study model cut into the site, showing that we essentially occupied the fringes. Also thought of it as iconography. There's a huge rivalry between Kaohsiung and Taipei. And this is actually from the competition brief that compared the size of Taipei 101, which is a very large building, the second one, actually this one up here in the scale, to the size of the site, adjacent to a very large building in its own right, from which this picture was taken, which marks the landscape now, the jumbo-sized landscape of New Kaohsiung. And this was very much thought to be a part of this big world. Therefore, we took on the entire site, as opposed to taking on just one or just two sides of it. The way we took it on was really comes from the fact that 20,000 people at one time might come and go in a single afternoon. Something that a single building has somewhat difficulty doing, but a city can do quite easily. Cities can manage large numbers of people in short periods of time, such that it was obvious from the beginning that we would take an aggregate, make an aggregate solution. The aggregation, the unit of aggregation, the module, is represented in the lower left. It's a transition from a single center to a double center, which in our mind set up the main purpose of the project, which was a theatrical, was a theater motif. But more generally, if not a little bit simplistically, moving from single to double, or from a singularity to a duality, or from private to a private condition to something that's more public. This was registered in the for lack of a better word, dyad, the monad and the dyad, which set the undercurrent, the underpinning of the project, as you can see there. The project then occupied sectors, which we divided up. There was a requirement for an outdoor park, which is in this sector, a bridge over an existing river, the entertainment sector, a pop music museum, and a small, well, relatively small maritime museum on the right. What was interesting is that it really was too big to be architecture and almost too small to be urbanism. And that's what as I said, attracted us to the program, that we were trying to somehow negotiate between the two and see, moving from architecture towards urbanism, if we could make a kind of substantial connection, if this was a way through in scale to just explore the interface between the two. It was also going from single to monad to dyad to a figure. It was a means of taking a field condition, and because it is a monumental presence in the city, we had to have a strategy to create a figure. And out of the field, out of the basic pieces, recombining them, or pulling a figure out of that became a precondition, knowing that we had to do it. What was otherwise engaging us was the fact that there were these 13 different essentially roads coming into the project, which were dead end. They dead ended at the void. And how to pick up the energy that's coming off of those specific roads and the dense urban fabric that surrounded it, and turn it from a dead end into a kind of circuit. And I think it's fairly self-explanatory. way that we manipulated the basic circular unit and then connected it and interlinked it with a fairly complex program, the program you can see on the right being spelled out. It's a very simple strategy of setting out a field, providing the means for figuration, and then coming up with a access, a way to penetrate that field to open up these programs, these main programs to the city surrounding it. This, I suppose, is the moment that the diva is just about to arrive to the adoring crowds, the moment that the social space is, so to speak, activated. It is the occasion, the moment that the intention, the shared intention of the people there comes together. This is a view from the bridge. One of the modules is a bridge that crosses the existing river, looking at the large amphitheater which occupies the center. This is the interconnection with the city. We wanted a geometry that was very, very rigorous and self-referencing, but at the same, at the same time was utterly connected to the world outside of it. And this just goes through the pieces of the program, which were pretty much, despite the fact that the underpinning is pretty geometrically demanding, restrictive, I would say, gave us a lot of, ultimately in the end, gave us a lot of room to develop different characters around the site, but still hold it together, primarily by the large figure in the center. One side of it was we reconstructed the estuary, did a lot of environmental research, which I'm not showing, but it was backed up by a public space, a beach, for lack of a better word, a sand beach that faced the open amphitheater. And the program on the right-hand side, towards the back of the screen here, is the pop music exhibition space at the Maritime Museum. These are the two theaters, which I think I have some images of. We did take on this void. This is a really crude way to explain in the competition that we had put a field of lights. There's a tradition in Kaohsiung of lighting the Riverwalk, which we extended to this big open space. There's the performance theater, about 3,500 people, and then the 12,000 seat amphitheater with a single choke point, which, believe it or not, was a requirement in the program. This is the Love River that comes out of the city. This is obviously the estuary condition that was reconverted. The bridge over the Love River, which I just showed. This is around the back of the large performance theaters, one of these dead-end conditions that picks up a plaza and creates the entrance for two performance theaters with the wet plaza in the background. Estuary. There's the diva again as the culmination, but also the question about the social. And as an example, what we were doing in this project and thinking about how to make the bridge between architecture and urbanism is to be particularly sensitive to the effects of infrastructure. The power of infrastructure, not just in this building, but in this project, but in any project, is that it reaches deeply into buildings, that they are conditioned buildings are completely conditioned by infrastructure in a way that we really don't acknowledge when we're preoccupied with buildings, I think. We all have thought of the examples of taking a spec office building and putting it in a central business district in a downtown area, and then taking that same architecture, that same building, and putting it in an office park on the edge of town. And we know instinctively, because we're sensitive to environments, that those are completely different environments because of the different urban conditions they sit in. And the difference for us, for me, is in the infrastructure. One of the ways we define infrastructure, if you'll allow me to read for just a second, infrastructure is everywhere. It exists all around us, even where you are right now. You can see it when you're at your desk. Look out your window or when you watch television. You can feel it when you go to work, go to church, go to school. Urban infrastructure is there every time you walk out the door. It operates without effort 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Infrastructure cannot be put down like a newspaper or a book, shut off like a computer or radio, or walked out of like a bad film or a bad building. It determines if you walk fast or walk slow, left or right, up or down. It determines actually if you walk at all. Up until the moment it breaks down, infrastructure operates in the background, leaving us largely unaware of the complex network of subjects and objects that surround and define us. The fact that infrastructure is unseen makes it more important, not less. It's a kind of sensitivity I've always sort of carried with me, and it seemed to me for a long time to be the key, however it can be addressed, between the architectural and the urban. It is the atmosphere that this building sitting on a campus contains because it sits on a campus as opposed to a city street. That's architecture. That's something that we can work with. That raises a second question. This voided out diagram is not very good introduction to it, but it's the best I could actually do. It's not the way the void is usually represented. The void, as I said before, is the water. But it is asked the question of what infrastructure. Number one, what would this building be if the infrastructure weren't around it? It would be not a very interesting building. But more important is the fact that the infrastructure that surrounds this building is outmoded. It's going to take me a few passes at this to get it across. But this infrastructure is gridiron infrastructure. It is like the infrastructure of LA County. It is a continuous open gridiron grid structure which in its formation is ancient. What we also know, because we can look at Google Maps like everyone else, is that the way that Kaohsiung, like the United States, has been built over the last 50 years has nothing to do with this gridded infrastructure. Not at all. It in some ways was disturbing to us to the extent that led us to ask the question, are we really dealing with urbanism if the infrastructure that we are intervening in is outmoded? Is it not, in fact, a rehabilitation project, this project, in so much as the urbanism that it responds to, the urbanism that it reflects and mirrors and exploits, that's the word, is in fact not the urbanism we build today, not the urbanism that's been built by the last 50 years. This has been the question that's I've pursued for quite some time, and I want to show, to just briefly remark on that phenomenon, that some of the buildings I admire the most. And that we all admire the most, are what could be called rehabilitation projects. They work off of the relationship of an urban, in a relationship like the project I just showed, with an urban fabric that is at least 50 years obsolete. There is nothing wrong in my mind at all. I'm not trying to denigrate the activity that architects do and must do, which is to rehabilitate old urban infrastructures. It's an important job that architects do, and it's been with us for a while. The Pompidou Center in 1977, I think, really initiated it. It was the turning point of modern urbanism, where the forms of the megastructure drawn from archigram and any number of projects, actually, which those forms being about new cities, about alternative forms of habitation, about a different kind of environment than the traditional environment that modernism had imposed upon us. These forms are then used, filtered back into the city in a fairly traditional way to define a monumental order. And like I said, the birth of the 20th century monument occurred in 1977. In some ways, it's a transition that we're still very much in the middle, that very much colors the way we think of architecture and the way we think of practice, and really the way we think of urbanism, because we oftentimes look at buildings like these as buildings that are intensely urban, despite the fact that they are built in and contrast to, by intention, historically, an existing urban fabric. Obviously, the prime example of this and the fulcrum of the contemporary monumentality is Bilbao, and the effect of that building on the way we think about architecture as practitioners and the way other people think about architecture as an activity, I think is, again, it struck me as I dug up the original plan for where it sat, of how well it fit into the 1876 plan, which you can see illustrated there in the red marker. There's the site, the future site of Bilbao within that plan. It's an axial relationship with, as you know, the plaza at the end of the axis, and the Jeff Koons puppy standing in for the monument figure at the end of that axis. And it did a remarkable job in Bilbao. And as I said, it's an important way for architects to relate to urbanism as rehabilitation of traditional urban environments. What we also know about Bilbao is this is today, this plan is less than 20% of the urban substance of Bilbao, right? There's another 80%, and it, of course, doesn't look anything like this. This other 80% was, in a weird kind of reverse logic or historical retrospective, the subject of a project by Candelas, Josephs and Woods, a very important firm in the 50s, members of Team 10, who also did this project, competition in Bilbao, called the Asila Valley Competition, where they first developed what they called the STEM project. I don't know if you know much about Team 10. In some ways, it's not necessary to know so much about the project. I will show you in a second how the STEM project relates to contemporary infrastructure. But the fact is that was the city they were working on. They were working on the Bilbao that was being built in the 60s, as opposed to Bilbao that had been built in the 19th century. And my point is pretty simple. Isn't this another job for architects to do, besides the rehabilitation? Isn't this, in addition to rehabilitating our traditional urban cores? I've read various statistics that say that 80% of the built substance today, the environments that we live in, has been built in the last 50 years. You look at maps, you can sort of get anecdotal evidence. It's hard to nail it down. But the amount of the built environment that is in fact traditional, that is in fact gridded of that old infrastructure is now very, very small and worth preserving, because many of the qualities that exist in that 20% the historic urban environment do not exist anymore in the contemporary environment. Yet at the same time, there is this other project which I think we've forgotten about. And the interlude that I wanted to talk about is between the two projects. You know, I showed you coming from architecture to urbanism. I'm going to show you a project in a second of urbanism going back down to architecture. But before I do that, I have to talk about the urbanism that has been built in the last 50 years and what distinguishes it from the urbanism of the past and how we can identify it. It's an argument that I've been working on for a long time. To finish up this little section, I use this quote from Aldo van Eck, who you may or may not know. I think he's being taught again, but I'm not sure. He was taught when I was a student, which is how I come to know the quote. And this was a challenge, which I think was really a challenge for Team 10. And this is a series of questions. Can architects meet society's plural demand? In other words, can we generate a collective identity at any level around pop music or whatever? Can architects possibly substitute the present loss of vernacular, and by that what he meant is gridded urban architecture, the bylaw streets of London, the alphabet city, the I-shaped, O-shaped, U-shaped buildings of gridiron cities in the United States. The present loss of vernacular and still build a city that is really a city, a livable place for a large multitude, mass of people. Vernacular was always able to cope with plurality in formal days. This is the first problem confronting the architect-urbanist today. If society has no form, how can architects build the counterform? I think it's kind of, in some ways it's a remarkable statement. Kenneth Frampton wrote an entire essay on it in the Team 10 compendium book, if you want to look it up. But in some ways it reflects its moment. You can read in this the collapse of the social, the absence of the social is kind of an existentialist angst, which of course Team 10 had in spades. I think what he's arguing is that there is no social and there is no vernacular. I would take much, after many years of thinking and working on the problem of contemporary vernacular, I would take issue with that. And I think we must look for the form of the social in the urbanism, but not in the urbanism of the grid, not in the urbanism of the traditional gridded infrastructure, but in the urbanism of the present. I first studied and started thinking about this urbanism here when I was a student at SciArt. And I one day drove too far south and got off the freeway in Orange County and said, what the hell is this? Where am I? Right? It's so strikingly not LA. I needed to figure out if I was pretending to be an expert in the environment, how could I possibly account for the difference between the world of Orange County, which, as we know, if you study it, I think Orange County has 250 municipalities as compared to Los Angeles County, which has maybe 10 or 15, maybe probably a lot more, but certainly not 250. It's a post-war phenomenon built in the last 50 years. It is a cul-de-sac city. It is a city made of spines. This diagram was really made for Houston, which is the diagram that fits most American cities. Los Angeles and Orange County are nicely juxtaposed, but the fringes of Houston, everything that was built after 1950, is cul-de-sac. It's Orange County. Everything that was built before was gridded, and there's a loop road that defines, like a tree ring, the difference. This is the model of most American cities. A lot of American centralized American cities, that shifts at the loop into this new mode of urbanism. And we conveniently call it suburbanism, suburbanism. It's subsidiary to the urban core. We also call it sprawl. Neither one of those are accurate. For example, outside the loop in Houston, as Richard was saying, are gargantuan carbon boots, I think, tied to this type of environment. 3 million people live. Inside the loop, 500,000, if that, people live. Which one is suburbanism? Right? How do you use the word suburbanism in that context? The second word that we use to denigrate or to somehow ignore the urbanism that's been built for the last 50 years is sprawl. And it's clear to me, it was the subject of a book that I wrote 10 years ago, that there's no such thing as sprawl. That in fact the contemporary urban environment has been structured more completely, you could argue, than any urban environment that we've built to date. There's not sprawl. It's sprawl in our imagination. It's sprawl in the context of traditional urbanism. What I'm arguing is this is the world that we think we inhabit in some ways. This gridded world of blocks and streets and the grid plan that contains the blocks and streets that goes out to infinity. But this is the world, even in Los Angeles, as you know, that we actually inhabit, where that even if that grid, as you have so much grid in Los Angeles that it seems like it is equivalent to urbanism, even that grid is completely changed by the emergence of this closed urban system that surrounds it. And that change needs to be acknowledged. The way that I started to acknowledge that, just briefly, this is a bit academic, is to look at the work of Ludwig Hilbersheimer. I won't go into it in depth, but he identified the equivalent of contemporary urbanism's block, which is the spine. Much, much, much bigger than the block, which never, at least in traditional cities, really gets above 600, 800 feet. You lose the anthropomorphic dimension, as opposed to the spine, which is enormous. Still hear me? Can hear my finger. Is this better? Good. Thank you. There's this strange man who you probably have heard of because he's completely associated with Mies. Thought of it often as Mies's sidekick. Ludwig Hilbersheimer immigrated with Mies to the United States in the late 30s, taught at IIT the rest of his life, and developed a substantial urban project based not on the urbanism they left behind, but the urbanism that he anticipated in the United States. Even in 1927, he was looking at a spine-based urbanism, which is just from the historical record represented in that sketch. And what I'm arguing is that megalopolis, which a term that we come to under a different rubric. We come to it from the human sciences, we come to it from urban geometry. Megalopolis, as it was defined famously by John Gottman in 1960 when he published this book, was really attempting to grapple with the urbanism of the last 50 years. What was emerging already after only 15 years of its construction as a new type of urban environment. The problem was that Gottman didn't have a feel, a sense, a notion that there was form associated with megalopolis. Megalopolis has form, and that form was identified by Ludwig Hilbersheimer long actually before megalopolis emerged. And that form is an aggregate form, and the aggregate is this spine. The spine, which was originally designed in 1927, shows us our world, at least our world of Houston, where we have main freeways, we have feeder roads, we have strip centers and big boxes, we have industrial parks, and we have subdivisions. Right? What I would just quickly, the way I used Hilbersheimer was he did a series of replanning projects which are, on the face of it, actually frightening, where he took existing urban grids and transformed them into modern urban environments, what he called modern urban environments. This is a project running down the right-hand side of the screen in 3 stages of transformation of Marquette Park, a district, at that time, depressed district in Chicago, built around park designed by the Olmsted brothers, where he actually started removing the urban infrastructure and creating these cul-de-sac conditions that we obviously recognize today as the DNA of megalopolis of the modern city. He didn't talk about erasing form. He talked about the production of space. That's what that was his ideal, that was his ambition, that was his game, his entire MO, that was his utopian aspiration, is that the city, the new city, the modern city, the contemporary city, would be a city that's infused, that is dominated not by form, but by space, and by extension, by nature. These are just simple redrawings of that project. Started out, I think there's something like 175 roads coming into the original district, and there are like 12 at the end, where he's reduced it down. But it was not a question of form. It was a question of space, and we made one alteration to that drawing to put it into the American context, more directly into the urban context, where you see what that space, the use that space was put to, and the very important difference that Hilbersheimer didn't acknowledge, which is the traffic hierarchy laid on top of it. But the reason I bring this up in these other replanning projects is to show the transformation. It's in many ways why we don't recognize the difference between the urbanism of 50 years ago and the urbanism of today, is that one grew out of the other. But it grew out of it in a way that was definitive, in a way that we know. We have not built gridded urban infrastructure in the last 50 years. We haven't. We've built this infrastructure, the infrastructure on your right. And that was, a transformation of Chicago. He did a medium-sized transformation, which is Rockford, Illinois, which has got us in a studio I'm doing at Rice right now in association with Tom's Culture Now project, the transformation of Rockford. This is how Hilbersheimer imagined it for a medium-sized town. Rockford, as you probably can guess for yourselves, is a ford in the Rock River, and was originally oriented around the river, and then it grew out in typical gridiron fashion as a centralized city. Hilbersheimer example, his transformation is one of the most interesting and one of the early versions of linear cities, which are characteristic of modern. One of the real inventions of modern urbanism is linear urbanism. A lot of linear urbanism was based on machinic metaphors like the assembly line, but Hilbersheimer's was really based on the natural world. Obviously, there's a sympathy between the Rock River and the Rock River Valley in which it sits and the linear city in which he evolved in it. He saw the city, if you can believe this, you read his text, as a kind of organism that needed to be acclimated to its natural surrounding, right? That it had the qualities and characteristics of an organism, which is a pretty interesting way for this old minimalist to be thinking about urban environments. And we can see in his projection, this third one is not unlike what we find in the 1950s in Houston. A kind of intermediate state. You can almost say that Hilbersheimer went too far. The purpose of this is to suggest there's a big range between the grid and the spine that is actually more like the environments that we built. This is FM 1960 in Houston, a farm to market road. That's a freeway, Interstate 45 going north. Strip axis of the subdevelopment spine. This is a natural feature that cuts through, which is, of course, one of the reasons Hilbersheimer wanted to break up the city and infuse it with space, is to be more responsive to the natural environment. briefly. He also did a very small city, and what's interesting about this is a little regional town called Elkhorn, Wisconsin. Transformed it into one of the single units, a single spine, and really remapped the town around the new freeway. In fact, if you look at a plan of Elkhorn now, it resembles this in some way. But you can see him taking the main street apart and reconstituting it out of the freeway in the way that small cities in America have been franchised and bypassed for the last 50 years. What's interesting about this is that we usually think of megalopolis as something that happens in big places, but megalopolis is everywhere. It happens in small places as well. We used to base, right now, traditionally, even today, we base subdivisions on the small town, right? That's the basis of new urbanism, is that the town, the American town, is the unit of aggregation in a modern megalopolis. This turns that on its head. It's not that the small town remakes the big city. It's the big city that's remaking the small town. And you have to sort of acknowledge what has in some ways occurred. I mean, you see so many politicians going to small towns and saying, "Oh, this is the heart of America." And in fact, Sarah Palin's America is not the same as say, the Coen Brothers America. And the Coen Brothers America has a lot to do with what is actually out there, and the transformation of not only the small town, but of the region itself. It is where it is regionalism playing out in a big way. To return to my topic, so as not to take too long, if I could just do this one little diagram. This is a traditional urbanism of Marquette Park, Central Park, where the streets themselves extend to the horizon now. So that's the fantastic thing about the 19th century grid-iron plan. Every street went to the horizon. Oh, the form was open, the space was closed, it was framed, like Central Park, like Marquette Park, like Pershing Square, for example. These are framed spaces. You have open formed and closed space. On the bottom, Hilbersheimer's transition, you have the opposite, where you have this one right here. Closed form, cul-de-sacs, terminal conditions, right? Everything has a stopping point. And open space. It seems to me, if I map these on these two axes, where we want to be is somewhere in between, with open form and open space. This is I think the counterform that Van Eyck was looking for, which is why I brought the quote back here. If we're going to construct a social, if we're going to connect the form to the social, I think it has to be done in terms of not of open formed and closed space, which is the metropolis right here, or open space and closed form, which is megalopolis, which is what we have, for example, in Orange County. But in these opposite quadrants, the closed form and closed space is obviously a prison, and open form and open space is where I think we want to be. It's the city, or at least a tentative definition of the city. And as opposed to what Van Eyck said, it produces a subject. If you will allow me one last set of diagrams, a really simple overlay of an attempt to map the social onto the formal. This is a more traditional urban environment, and you recognize that social groupings, which can be represented in these circles perhaps, can be of any size or in some ways indifferent to the substrate. This could be Chelsea, this could be the Flatiron District, this could be Midtown, this could be Upper East Side, it could be Mid-Wilshire, Hancock Park. The grid was in some ways fluid, and the form of the social, there was a connection, I think, between the openness of the grid and the ability to establish these localities like the ones I just mentioned. in that context. What happens in the occurrence is that there's more and more of a lock between the infrastructure and the social, where these groups start to get pinned down and defined. This is maybe moving 20 maybe up through the 70s, where we have these large superblock plans. It's a diagram on the left that shows a three-level hierarchy, where you have the big boulevards, and then you have superblocks related to them, and then you have the streets and the driveway and the house, giving you a three-level hierarchy, starting to lock these social circles, which are no longer free to move around, but have a kind of definition that they didn't have in the past. Take that one step further, say past 1970 in the cul-de-sac city, where it seems to me you take out the cross-axes, which is the difference between this. This, by the way, is probably Broadacre City. This is more closely related to Hilbersheimer's image, and certainly more closely related to what we built today, which is when you take all the cross-axes out of the grid, it's like a whole room full of a restaurant full of tables. Everyone at the tables gets up and starts to eat at a lunch counter. And the relationship is now side to side as opposed to across the table. There's something about pulling out the cross-axes of these that start to of the grid, the substrate, that starts to individualize each specific destination, which I think in some ways is starting to identify this kind of infrastructure, this form, the spine form, with a kind of individuation. We know this. This is a sort of Design 101 diagram, and you've all confronted this in one way or another, where you have the 13 connected points on the left-hand side, 13 connected points on the right-hand side. They're the same size, the same points in space. And we know, despite the fact that we have LA is unbelievably congested, we still have options. We can move around. If this is my house, this is my office, this is the grocery store, that's the doctor's office, this is the school, that mathematicians will tell you that very quickly we get close to an infinite number of potential linkages between these 13 points, right? On the right-hand side, those linkages are all surprisingly dropped down to one. Only one way to get from this point to this point, where you're constantly feeding back up the hierarchy from the lower level to the upper level, back out to a trunk road, maybe to the feeder road, and then back down into the trunk road and out to another spine. The diagram is always, as you know, striking because of its elimination of choice, and something that strikes us is incredibly outrageous in the way we normally think about suburban environments. Freeways, automobiles, freedom that's implied in those kinds of tropes aren't really played out in the substrate that structured them. And terminal points. It's not I threw this diagram in here at this particular point, certainly not to damn the megalopolis or say that it's a reactionary or fascistic, or it's taking away our precious options. It is simply to notice that a city made of terminal points and terminal conditions is very different than a city made of circuits. And it's something that we need to take hold of and understand the difference between the two, the circuits and terminal conditions. And it's a larger effect. It's not just suburbs. It's not just cul-de-sacs. It's the way we structure our environment. At the end of the road, any road we're on now is not the horizon. At the end of the road is a parking garage in some ways. One little piece of reading about this spiral figure that is drawn on this. This diagram maps the logic of the terminal node in cul-de-sac urbanism in megalopolis. The path to the specific place in the cul-de-sac will always terminate in an exclusive destination or endpoint, The path on the open grid, on the other hand, will never terminate because the grid is infinite in all directions. As opposed to the cul-de-sac's termination of movement, the grid offers only a series of arbitrary stopping points that are often described as coordinates in space. For example, 239 East 339th Street. The organizational logic of an open grid produces points that are connected by an infinite number of circuits or loops. The organizational logic of the cul-de-sac produces, on the contrary, a distribution of terminals or terminal distribution. In the cul-de-sac city, the pattern of movement through urban space traces the figure of a discrete spiral through a succession of overlaid structural hierarchies described in the image. This path might begin on a primary urban freeway and from there turn inward toward a singularly defined space. This turning, spiraling path from freeway to feeder to collector to development spine to driveway forms the trajectory of a closed urban system. Turning inward upon itself, the path configures a series of discrete segments, each more exclusive than the last. Everyone now lives not on an anonymous grid coordinate, but at the end of a particular path, on the last driveway, on the last cul-de-sac, in a city whose overall form is unknowable. In the cul-de-sac city, we are right where we have always wanted to be, at the very origin of the spiral. Each of our delicate egos seated at the base of a headlong downward implosion, a terminal destination. The spiraling inward constitutes the existential reality of the cul-de-sac environment. This is a lock. For me, it's a lock between the formal and the social that can't be denied. It is a habitual pattern of movement. It is a much larger than the traffic engineers, of much greater significance than the traffic engineers would have you believe. And I think it defines, in some ways, we recognize ourselves in this, in our age of entitlement, in our Facebook age, for example, where we hold out our individuality in the face of the massive structures around us as the ultimate aim and goal, and where this actually goes. It's not to take a position on it, because I think we have to be professionals, right? We need to understand it. We need to not embrace it, but not reject it, and understand how it is that it reflects the deeper social dimension. I think what's important for me is that this is a starting point, this bond between the social and the formal, and I think it describes the urbanism that defines us, if I could say it that way. Perhaps an antidote for this is a brief quote from Michel Foucault. Do not demand of politics that, this is from 1968, if you can believe it, do not demand of politics the right, that it restore the rights, in quotation marks, of the individual as philosophy has defined them. The individual is the product of power. What is needed is to de-individualize by means of multiplication, displacement, diverse combinations. The group must not be the organic bond uniting hierarchized individuals, but a constant generator of de-individuation. I like it because it's turning around and going the other direction. And it's a kind of warning, a tonic of our obsession with individuality. Another way to say exactly the same thing is something that someone sent me the other day, which is in the face, these pigs in a barn. They've made a bunch of changes on Facebook to refine how you mark. It used to be you had to just say, I like this. Now, I read, I love, I hate, I adore, I read, I buy, I don't buy. In some ways, the perils of individuation couldn't be more obvious. It's almost as if the social has been literally deconstructed due to its constituent element in the individual, only to be reassembled electronically. And it's I was warned by my daughter not to show this image for fear of being a curmudgeon. But I think the point is not so much that social networks are the end of the world. It's that social networks need to be used to create a material culture, right? That we can't live with just the wall and Facebook. It's not enough to have a bunch of server farms in the middle of the country and say that's the physical manifestation of the social. However attractive the power of social networks may be, I think that our job is in some ways to employ them, to use them certainly, but to insist on material, social as a manifestation of a material culture. That's something that's so obvious, it's almost embarrassing to say it. And there are a lot of things that you could say about how the social might be manifest today. If you have a philosophical bent, you could read Hart and Negri on multitude, or Philando on the social assemblage. If you're interested in sciences, the actor network theory by Latour is a remarkable analysis of the physical manifestations of social networks. Or you could look at a photographer like Gursky, who does it, who's much closer to our own world, our own interests, who goes out and searches for dimensions of the social as they might be emerging. This is a Chicago Stock Exchange. It's almost like a colored palette. This is in Hong Kong, a race, which you can see on the screen here. And the social doesn't necessarily, manifestation of the social and its dimension does not necessarily mean, a big meeting or group of people. This is in some ways inconclusive, but I think it's important that it becomes part of our reflection. Oops. And then maybe we can find some way to, in our own terms, begin to project a social dimension. I'm completely out of time, but it's okay because this is a project that's incomplete. It's an attempt to come from the urban, which is, I discovered, quite hard to do, towards the architectural, to draw start with the large and move to the small. It's a project in the Fifth Ward. It was funded by the NEA a couple of years ago, it's just an ongoing open-ended project that I invented myself. The Fifth Ward in Houston is a travesty. It's the lowest income. It's the lowest income area in the city. It's one of the ways I got funded for it is it's an enormous. It's a social disaster, basically. And I sort of took it on as a challenge. Partly because I get funding for it, but partly because this is what I found when I looked at it, which is this broken grid, which is exactly what I was explaining earlier, somewhere between the world of the cul-de-sac and the world of the grid. This one just happened by itself, by the fact that infrastructural projects, street demolitions by industries, big train yard, freeway construction, all conspired to fracture this grid, giving it, in spite of its horrible social condition, a quite beautiful quality which we thought we could work with. The traditional response to this would be fix it, put it back, make the infrastructure whole again, reestablish the streets and build the houses side by side on them again. But I really felt and still feel, despite a good amount of criticism on this project, that it's not enough to return the Fifth Ward to it was laid out in actually I don't remember when it was laid out now. Let's just say the turn of the 19th century. It's actually older than that, but its full gridding didn't happen until the turn of the 19th century. It was originally a slave town, founded by freed slaves. Anyway,
And we resisted the idea that the best solution was nostalgic, to go back to what it was, to make it whole again. The question being, couldn't we offer a modern infrastructure as opposed to a 19th century infrastructure? And wasn't it already on the make in the way that it had been formed? The way we got a handle on that is by a really simple accounting system of intersections, of one-way, two-way, three-way, and four-way intersections. One-ways are dead ends. They're distributed up there. I'm not going to show you many pictures of the Fifth Ward, so I want to talk about it in a more general sense of how it is you try to hit one way to hit these marks between the traditional continuities of the grid and the more contemporary discontinuities of the cul-de-sac. So these are the point fields that come out of those studies as the existing street intersections, all intersections, demolished intersections, which we were, if you can believe it, pretty excited by, because we really don't ever account for the things that aren't built in the first place. We found a way to account for them. Three-way intersections, which are T intersections. You know how these, you probably don't know it as much here as in other cities that are built in smaller increments where you have T intersections that function literally like walls. And four-way intersections, which not surprisingly mark the residential concentrations. What we did is did a tally and found that each different program area, which are listed here, have a typical number of intersections and a certain type of intersection. And it sounds fancy, but it's really straightforward. That in big industrial areas don't need a lot of roads, and they all have dead ends in them, and they have staging yards and storage yards, et cetera. So it has a very low continuity. Essentially, you can, if a score an intersection from 1 to 4, continuity number 4.0 continuity is completely open. A 1.0 continuity couldn't exist because it's a one-way, a field of one-way point. But you get the idea that each different program had a different continuity, and we could add those up over a given area and then integrate them so the three-ways and the four-ways and the one-ways all made sense together and generate a street pattern out of them, which is what we did. We did a zoning study, which I'm not going to bother you with, that was quite complex, of how we simultaneously did mixed-use zoning and single-use zoning, overlaid the two into these separate districts, but then laying out a distributed pattern of uses, came up with this grid pattern, which came from the continuities that each use required. The other thing that we did was we grouped together the uses that had very little building associated with them or none. There was a lot of empty space, a good amount of park space that we included in this total. And you can see in this diagram right here, if it's clear on the screen, this is the series of open spaces which are not surprisingly marked by the one-way intersections, the dead-end streets, which, as opposed to the way we traditionally frame urban space with an edge, with a form, we're thinking of these dead ends, the place where form stops, is a place where space starts. At any rate, this spatial core of the plan was intending to use space, open space, as a binding agent, something that held it together. This is the image of it, the one-way intersections here. We used the three-way intersections as virtual walls. We didn't want to. What's happening in the Fifth Ward is their developers are getting together huge parcels and walling it off and making enclaves, which means no more Fifth Ward. Wonder if we could go part way there, because we knew the only way that we could attract investment was if in some ways we limited the wide open gridiron that existed in the Fifth Ward and make the risk and minimize the risk. What happened briefly again is that City of Houston was giving away tax delinquent lots to developers to develop it and stir development, but they were giving them away hodgepodge all across the Fifth Ward. And so we came in with this plan and said, you need to isolate the tax delinquent lots you're giving away in one certain section. And you can actually make it a much more attractive prospect, not only because it's not taking the risk that the whole Fifth Ward has to turn around, but you have a distinct area that can be marketed that way. And you can also provide the amenities that people outside the loop come to expect. One of those, not surprisingly, is open space. Given that we did want subdivision in the plan, it's a kind of controlled closure. We used the three-way walls as a way to separate certain areas of the plan, and what you can really see are the residential districts by these T intersections, right? Virtual walls, not material walls. And these are the residential areas in the four-way switches. We did a second overlay on that, which would take me too long to get into, but it explored the world of aggregation at a larger scale, and explored the world of everything that exists as a design possibility between the spine and the grid. And we came up, these are algorithmic tables where we did one, right? This is copy move, copy move, copy move in the horizontal direction, copy move in the vertical direction. They're fairly straightforward, and we assembled them into an aggregation. What we're actually moving towards is so we're trying to take on the problem, which is the real problem of the megalopolis, is that it doesn't accumulate. There, in the simplistic terms, there is no whole that is greater than the sum of the parts, and it's absolutely possible, defensible, to say that the very definition of a city at its basic level is a whole that exceeds the sum of the parts. In megalopolis, we just produce parts and parts and more parts, and another deal gets made in at a bank with a developer, with a landowner, and 100 more parts get added to it. The question that we wanted to ask with this is, are there possibilities for aggregation at this large scale? Is it possible to aggregate a whole accumulate a whole out of a series of parts? And we did it by trying to actually exploit these hierarchies. There was a complex, these are, like I said, it's an incomplete project. I would have to say that despite the fact we went through a number of part-to-part variations, we never came to resolution. Some of the more interesting studies had to do with transitioning from the original housing stock to the new housing stock, which developed by fiat, interesting part-to-part relationships. But part of the study was also to study density, so we looked at increasing or varying the building stock in terms of a collection of different scaled objects, pavilions, bars, and towers, and the possibilities that if you array these things in a certain way, that the parts could start to resonate with each other, and make the very elements of the megalopolis, the structure, the infrastructure, start to aggregate into a greater whole. And that's it. It's the end of my slides.